Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Danny Nobis. I'm the University's Pro Vice-Chancellor for External Affairs. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the University, to the Antonin Artaud Building, to the Hillingdon Literary Festival, and to our session on Utopian Dreams. Now, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Utopia, the book, the vision, and then we have two eminent speakers to enlighten you about their own utopian visions and dreams. After that, our eminent professor of music, Peter Weigold, will show a clip about, shall we call it a workshop? Would you call it an experiment?
Yeah.
Something he did,
Dialogue.
a dialogue. Something he did recently, but with various members of staff here at Brunel, although the event didn't take place at Brunel, I think, around the notion of the sublime. And after that, we're going to go on the stage to have a conversation, and after that, we're going to open it up to you. And I hope you will have some questions and comments about what's been discussed here. Now, we wouldn't be here, I think, without this man. This is Sir Thomas More, Saint Thomas More, because he was actually canonized, if my memory serves me well, sometime during the early 20th century. Not because he performed any miracles, but he was considered by the Roman Catholic Church to be a martyr for the faith. So Saint or Sir Thomas More, in 1516, published a book that, with hindsight, changed the face, I'm not going to say of the world, but the face of thought, because it proved to be one of the most influential pieces of literature cum political philosophy that was released. And the whole inspiration for this event is really the 500th anniversary of the publication of Thomas More's Utopia. I thought I could show you the frontispiece of the original book, which was published in Louvain in December 1516. I'm not going to read you the full title. Under the title of Libellus Vere Aurus Nec, which means a lovely golden little book. That is both salutary and funny and humorous about the Republic of Utopia, etc., etc., etc. And both the title here and the contents of the book were meant to be distinctly ambiguous. So it was both a book that was designed as a piece of political philosophy and a piece of imaginative, creative writing. And the very name Utopia was meant to be ambiguous, because in that word, Thomas More played on the place that represents both a better place and a no place, because what we use in English, the "you", actually comes from both the Greek "ev", which means good, and the Greek "ou", which means none. So the whole concept of utopia is meant to represent an ideal society. But also a society that, strictly speaking, at an etymological level, of course, doesn't exist. And when it was published, it was replete with actually a drawing of the island in question, but also with the Utopian alphabet. And I don't think that Thomas More, 500 years ago, would have thought that his book is actually now translated into Utopian. Right. It takes a while to learn the alphabet, but every time I'm reading this on the tube, people say, "Well, what's that?" But there you go. It's Thomas More's Utopia in Utopia is now available. But over the past 500 years, the utopian tradition, which goes back long before More wrote the book, goes back as far probably as Plato's Republic, and also in a sense Plato's Critias and Timaeus, in which you find the concept of Atlantis. This utopian tradition has been quite extraordinary, successful, and continues to generate new pieces of work, both in the realm of political philosophy and in the realm of literature, particularly in the realm of science fiction. So these are just some brief examples of what it has generated. This is the New Atlantis, which came out in the early 17th century by Francis Bacon. Around the same time we had The City of the Sun by Tommaso Campanella, but particularly during the 19th century, sociologists, maybe I should just call them social scientists, like Charles Fourier and Saint-Simon, started taking that concept of utopia within the realm of political thought and came up with exceptionally influential ideas on how to create, how to design, how to implement a better society on the basis of some of the principles that More outlined in his book. But what we're faced with, and I hope that in the discussion we will be able to address some of these questions, what we're faced with is a question as to where the boundary lies between philosophy and literature, because More's book can be read as literature, but also as a piece of philosophy. We're faced with the question as to where the boundary lies between fantasy and reality, and in a sense also about the importance of fantasy for creating reality. But more fundamentally, I think we're faced with the question as to whether utopia is actually possible or desirable. There's been numerous examples over the past 500 years of people trying to use More's book as a source of creative inspiration for pursuing utopian projects, but most of them have failed quite radically. This is one of the most recent examples here. The Utopia Experiment, that's the title of the book, was initiated, I think, about 5 years ago by Dylan Evans, and it was a complete disaster, so much so that Dylan Evans himself had to be admitted to a mental institution at some point during the experiment, which he writes about with great candor in the book. So people continue to do this, but in a sense the experiments continue to fail, which raises the question as to whether the whole thing is actually possible or desirable. But within the realm of political philosophy, the concept of utopia is still very influential. Frederick Jamison, who is just about one of the most, I think, influential thinkers on the left in the US at the moment, recently released a book called American Utopia, in which he argues in favor for utopian thinking as a starting point for creating an alternative society. That's all I want to say by way of introduction. But you see that this small book, because it only came in at about 100 pages when it was originally published, this small book by Thomas More has really generated an enormous amount of creative and critical work, which we're still engaged in, and which I'm sure our speakers this afternoon will unpack a bit further. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Caroline Edwards. I'm not going to go through your whole biography because that would take us too long, so forgive me for doing a short introduction here. Dr. Caroline Edwards, who's a lecturer in modern and contemporary literature at Birkbeck, University of London. She's co-edited 2 books on living writers, completing a monograph entitled Fictions of the Not Yet. She's also project director of the Open Access Publisher, which I think is a really exciting project. You know, we talked about it earlier on. The Open Access Publisher, Open Library of Humanities, and founding and commission editor of an open access journal of 21st century literature called Alluvium. Caroline, over to you.
What I'm going to do is take this opportunity to take you on a kind of whistle-stop tour of the literary utopia. As has just been mentioned then in the introduction, this is a kind of form of political philosophy, if you like, a way of experimenting with different modes of government, different modes of social organisation. But there are kind of interesting aspects, formal aspects, literary properties contained within the utopia, as Thomas More coined the term in 1516. Am I allowed the clicker?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Taking control, right. Let's see if that works. Okay. Oh, sorry, I should say before I start, this image is absolutely fantastic. It's called The Year 2000. It's from a series by French artists who are invited to imagine what future society would look like in 2000 in the late 1900s. They were going to be on children's sweets and the backs of cigarette packets, but as I understand it, they never actually were published. So they're utopian visions of, you know, flying firemen of the future, and the retrofuturism is fantastic. So thinking about the New World and this idea of the literary utopia and where it was born, I think it's really important to think that in this period, you know, the kind of English Renaissance, when Thomas More, friends with, you know, known figures like Erasmus, personal advisor to Henry VIII, when he came up with this idea of utopia, it's worth bearing in mind that this is a period of colonial modernity. This is the period in which countries like England and other European nations are going out on these seafaring voyages off to the New World. And therefore, the kind of imagination that you would travel across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean and you would suddenly come across this hidden island, you know, sort of shipwrecked and land on an island and discover a mysterious and exciting new society, was very much couched in a kind of realist framework. When Thomas More published Utopia in 1516, this is a couple of centuries and a half before we really have the birth of the literary novel as we understand it. So in terms of sort of formal properties, when you look at the book Utopia, not in the Utopian, because unfortunately I'm not fluent in Utopian, but when you look at a version of it, it's framed and couched in these interesting ways. There are all these letters between More himself and Peter Giles and these other figures. And so it's very much presented as a kind of real voyage. This place really exists. And the key thing to remember is that Thomas More, and every writer since Thomas More who's been writing about utopia, is always very much rooted in the contemporary moment in which they're writing. The purpose of these books is to try and encourage the readership to reflect upon their own real world environment. So that kind of verisimilitude is kind of quite important. I thought I'd sketch out a few other very important literary utopias that followed More during the kind of Renaissance period. We have there Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun from 1602, and has been mentioned Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis. A nice image that I found of the New Atlantis. It's very much a text that tries to imagine scientific inventions, what the natural sciences could develop into. It's very concerned with a sort of didactic form of education. And you've got there those two gentlemen in this woodcut communicating with one another through a sort of primitive telephone kind of device. One that I'd like to reflect upon in a little bit more detail actually is Margaret Cavendish's The Blazing World from 1666. Margaret Cavendish was the Duchess of Newcastle, a highly educated and prolific woman. And she comes up with a kind of utopian text in which a young woman is walking along the seashore and is basically kidnapped by a bunch of lascivious sailors. And so she's taken onto their ship and she's a great risk. And it's a sort of very threatening seafaring kind of travelogue tale. And then as they get closer to the North Pole, all of the sailors suddenly freeze to death and this woman miraculously survives. And she traverses through the North Pole into this utopian kind of kingdom where she eventually becomes a sort of empress. And it's very interesting for many reasons. It combines that kind of philosophical discourse that is integral to these utopian texts. It's very much a text in which she's discoursing the scientific innovations of the day, and she wants to learn how this the kingdom of the blazing world has developed compared with her own home back in England. But at the same time, it's obviously a fantasy. It's a fantasy journey. It's a voyage replete with fishmen and bearmen and all kinds of animalised subjects that she comes to rule. And of course, for those of us who might be interested in gender and rethinking the literary canon from the perspective of overlooked women writers, I think Margaret Cavendish is a fantastic example. She's somebody that Virginia Woolf was very interested in writing about as well. So what we have in these early modern and Renaissance utopias then, we have this kind of meditation on the ideal commonwealth, particularly with reference to the classical world, to Aristotle's Poetics, to Plato's Republic. We also have explicit meditations on the politics of the age in which these texts were written. So in Thomas More's case, this is Tudor England, and he has some fantastic things to say in his text. For example, about Raphael Hythloday, the Utopian traveller, who's shown around the New World, has a great discourse on the abolition of private property, which seems surprisingly contemporary reading it now, and talking about the social ills of greedy landowners and poverty in London and class inequality. But then, of course, More plays with that in a very kind of playful, ludic sort of way by couching that, and at the end the figure More comes back and says, but of course this is ridiculous, we couldn't possibly have a society without money and without property. However, there are some good points about this Commonwealth. So you can already see the complexity, the layers in which these stories are told. They have a very serious message for their readership, but at the same time they're aware that the adjective utopian is a pejorative. It's used to refer to something that is unrealisable and fantastic. And that brings me neatly then, sort of the next stop on our whistle-stop tour really is the mid-19th century and some of these utopian socialists that we've heard a little bit about. The image here that you can see is the Welsh industrialist Robert Owen, who bought a religious commune in Indiana in 1825, and it became Harmony and then subsequently New Harmony. And so this is the great industrial age in which some of these industrialists consider their factory as an environment for experimentation, as a kind of social laboratory. So they're training up their workers in different ways. New Lanark is another very good example up in Scotland, in Lanarkshire. They're thinking about how children should be educated as well as working in the factory, how the workers should be able to have music lessons and dance and artistic engagement and so on. And these people were noticed by Marx and Engels, who very famously wrote about this idea of kind of utopian socialism. Of course, Marx and Engels then, trying to lead a communist revolution through the mid-19th century, were quite careful to differentiate their socialist, their scientific form of socialism from utopian socialism. So again, you see this tension between what is actually possible in political development or experimentation and what is just a fantasy world that's sort of held up as an inverse of our own world to show us our failings, as something we might aim for, but is it, as you suggest, desirable for us to try and reach that? So there's this question of empirical validity. Socialism then is trying to suggest that it's grounded in real life, in industrial labour, organisation, working class struggle, trying to move towards a non-alienated form of life in communism. But arguably communism itself is a very utopian project. I'm going to couch all of the 20th century communist projects as to whether those are definitely communist or not. But certainly at the time of Marx and Engels, the communist society had not yet happened. And so they're having to use this kind of speculative register to imagine what life might be like outside of capitalism. And that requires a great kind of leap of imagination, if you like. Okay, so moving on then. Something really interesting happens in the late 19th century. This is the next period that anybody interested in the evolution of the literary utopia absolutely has to go back to and have a look at. And what happens is there's a shift from utopia being an elsewhere in space, in cartography, right? Remember those new voyages to the New World, travelling off towards America or off towards Australasia and finding these utopian islands somewhere in these new societies. it shifts from being about space and cartography and geography, and it becomes about time. The idea of a uchronia, that utopia, that the utopian society is somewhere in the future or in another time or a parallel time. It goes from being an elsewhere to an else when. And if you start to think about this is absolutely no surprise. We've got industrialization happening, which means a standardization of global time, according to Greenwich Mean Time, for example. It's a time in which workers are processed through these large-scale factories as the kind of hegemonic form of work in the late 19th century. They're living by what we would now call a clock time. And so if you think of a film, for example, like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and that image of the clock, that the workers are desperately trying to control the clock comes to symbolize, the timepiece comes to symbolize a repressive form of social life whereby we're all governed and dominated by this very mechanized rapacious sort of machinic environment in which we have to produce because that's where we work. And so at this time then, we get a flourishing of literary utopias, particularly in North America, also in Britain, in Australia, New Zealand. A variety not just then of social experiments, but also experiments in literary form. I've picked out 3 here for you that I think are particularly pertinent to our discussion. The first of which then is Edward Bellamy's bestseller, Looking Backward, which classically has the visitor going off into the future and being guided around this sort of futuristic world. We should note that Bellamy's text was so popular in North America that it spawned hundreds of Bellamy societies where people would be campaigning at a local level for trying to think of a more socially oriented and utopian kind of politics. So it's hard to think now, but it was enormously influential at the time, really the bestseller of its day. Another good example then that we have here would be William Morris's News from Nowhere, published in 1890. Again, a uchronia. So William Guest, the protagonist, wakes up one day in the future, in the distant future in London, and in this sort of Arcadian, slightly neo-feudal pastoral version of the future, which Wells was particularly interested, because of course Wells had that interest in craftsmanship, in a kind of pre-capitalist form of labour and production and artisanal work. So William Guest wakes up and the great smelting factories, the polluted industrial centres in the Midlands, Manchester, Liverpool, elsewhere, have been obliterated. Nature has kind of taken over. And he's in a sort of post-revolutionary communist society in the future. Industrialisation has been reversed. And you get several of the classic tropes of the utopian novel, which is to say, you get a slightly schematic discourse. These are very discursive novels. They're very much about 2 people or 3 people talking with one another and discussing how can we do education better, what would gender relations be like in this future, do people marry or not, how can we live with one another. And in William Morris's future, people live in these kind of collective commune style sort of medieval barns, effectively, and they wear medieval dress. So in terms of style, it's quite a fun one to go back and read. And right at the end of the novel, William Guest says to the reader directly, I think this is really important, he says, go back and be the happier, he is told by the utopian inhabitants, go back and be the happier for having seen us, for having added a little hope to your struggle. And Guest reflects on this and says, yes, surely, and if others can see it as I have seen it, then it may be called a vision rather than a dream. So again, think about that tension between something that is fantastic and dreamlike and futuristic and something which is supposed to empower us in the here and now. William Morris, like H.G. Wells and others in sort of Hammersmith and West London, were very much a part of the sort of socialist politics and discourse of their day. And then another classic, this is just drifting now into the early decade of the 20th century, is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Hirland, a fantastic text. Gilman is a very interesting figure. She's self-published, it's kind of vanity publishing if you like, a serialised story about a utopia, a society just of women, where men have disappeared in history and women have found a way to miraculously reproduce without having any men. It's a kind of form of miraculous conception. And what happened was, although in the Forerunner, in her journal at the time, this was quite well known, the text disappeared and it dropped out of literary history and no one talked about it until 1979, during the feminist movement, when feminist critics and editors effectively recovered this text, put it together. So the version we have, the contemporary version, is an edited version, and there are various sort of less salubrious aspects like eugenics, which have been toned down a little in the edited version. And so as a part of the 70s feminist movement, then Gilman becomes revived. It's a very interesting text. All of these texts are very much in dialogue, not just explicitly with More's Utopia, but in Gilman's text, she's also very much engaged with Bellamy's novel Looking Backwards, and she herself had been one of these Bellamyites. She'd been working in the nationalist movement in California. Fantastic for many reasons. The women there are very athletic and very strong and competent. The young men who encounter this society are very impressed by their agricultural sophistication, by their techniques and so on. It's unambiguously Edenic. They have effectively turned their small state into a kind of garden. It's very productive. It yields a lot of fruit. Again, we have the abolition of private property. People can just live in one house or another house. They can travel for work. It doesn't really matter. There's also a reflection upon the way in which children are raised, and women who are deemed perhaps not best suited to motherhood are allowed to have children but are helped in how they bring up those children, because the children are kind of collectively raised according to a sort of feminist, pantheist, religious kind of sacred society. So there are clearly really important issues that Charlotte Perkins Gilman is trying to address. And I suppose perhaps the most important for us is the way in which the young contemporary American men reflect upon these women. They think they're going to turn up in this kind of Arcadia of sexy young girls and they can just kind of party with them and have fun, and it's nothing like that. When they first arrive and they're sort of manhandled, they said, you know, we're in the position of the suffragettes being sort of taken by the police and edged off. So there's a really interesting kind of role reversal and a reflection on the way in which sort of feminine charms, the way in which women wear great big bonnets and fancy dresses and have to be very engaging with their male companions, is something that the Hirlanders don't need to do. There aren't any men to please, and so the women are liberated to be kind of strong and forge this new society. So another moment that I would suggest now, well into the 20th century then, that is really interesting for those of us who work on literary utopias, would be the early Russian revolutionary period between about 1905 and shortly after the early years of 1917 with the Russian Revolution. The poster here, as you can see, is from A Journey to Mars. And any of you who are familiar with kind of Soviet propaganda posters with early silent cinema of this time, Eisenstein and so on, you'll be very aware of this grand sense of the future. This is a future in which scientific innovation matches design and kind of avant-garde styles, collage posters, juxtaposition in filmmaking, for example, where you have the kind of cross-cutting between images that jars the audience into thinking about what they're watching. It's a really kind of interesting period, and a period in which early ideas about space travel are very influential. And so you get a number of novels that deal with travelling to Mars, which is absolutely fantastic. And what they imagine is how the Martian, they're always a communist or socialist kind of Martian population, could help us back on Earth, and specifically in places like St. Petersburg or back in Russia, could help us to kind of reflect upon their own revolution and the politics of the time. In terms of historical context, this is a very rapidly changing environment. You've got electrification, the Great Siberian Railroad, new developments in aeronautics, in aviation. And so these give birth to early Russian science fiction texts in which you have these kind of heroic cosmonaut figures. So you have these engineers. They're always scientists who are protagonists of these texts. And there was a huge public appetite for this kind of material, for illustrated magazines that were showing astronomical photographs, developments in the telescope and photography and so on. Two that are definitely worth your time, I would say, Alexander Bogdanov's Red Star, again, a superior Martian culture which has had a much more successful socialist revolution than we were experiencing back on Earth at the time after the 1905 revolution. And also Tolstoy's Elita, from which Elita, Queen of Mars, quite a well-known early Soviet film, was adapted. And so what happens then, after this sort of brief moment in the sort of Bolshevik utopian imaginary, is that across Europe it leads into a period of dystopia, an imagination of totalitarian regimes, whether they're communist, whether they're fascist. Through the 1930s and 40s, we get a huge number of texts reacting against the rise of Nazism. And so at this time in Europe's history, it seems very unlikely that utopia is even possible, and therefore a number of dystopias become published. Yevgeny Zamyatin's We from 1924, a very interesting example of one. But I would suggest that actually We is as critical about the capitalist future as it is about the totalitarian or state-led collective future. And so they're still very rich texts today. Okay, moving towards the end of the 20th century then, what happens is in the late 1960s and early 1970s, actually utopia becomes back on the agenda, and this is in large part due to the fact that we've had various social movements, including feminism, a new kind of ecological awareness, and the growing prevalence perhaps of the political new left, people thinking about left-wing ideas. And so in this period, utopias become more complicated, as we can see in texts such as Joanna Russ's The Female Man. You might have a utopian community within these novels, but it's framed around often quite dystopian reflections on whether it's possible or not to live in that utopia, or whether that utopia is entirely imagined. Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, for example, the utopia in that novel is travelled to by the protagonist via a slightly psychotropic form of kind of telepathy. And she's in a mental asylum. So you can read the novel as they manage to travel, into some sort of distant future just through the power of their mind, or you can suggest that this is a response to a very difficult situation where she's locked up in jail as a result of structural oppression because she's a Chicana woman, she's Hispanic, she's been put in there by her abusive brother-in-law and so on. So interesting engagements. This isn't an image of the novel, but I think it quite accurately reflects what happens in the novel. These utopias, which seem very contemporary now, are all about slightly hippie ideas of growing vegetables, biodomes, deindustrializing and decentralizing the way in which we produce energy and the way in which we produce our own food and so on. And so that brings me really to my conclusion. What's happened to utopian texts in the 21st century? This is something I spent quite a long time thinking about, and I don't necessarily have a clear answer for you. But one thing that I would say is that there is, as you may well be aware, a number of contemporary writers who are very preoccupied with questions of apocalypse, questions of eco-catastrophe, questions of the end of the world. And there are obviously very clear reasons why we should reflect on these issues. They're very pressing for our own time. Now, whilst on the surface that might not sound very utopian, I would actually suggest that utopia and apocalypse have a long-standing connection in philosophical terms. If you understand apocalypse, according to its sort of Greek translation, as a process of unveiling, of sort of lifting the veil off something, seeing things clearly for the first time. Of course, in Christian and Judaic terms, it's associated with a new beginning, the New Jerusalem, which is an apocalyptic vision that John of Patmos imagines seeing. Then it might not surprise you to realize that texts about the apocalypse, a fantastic example here would be, I have some quotations from Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. A post-apocalyptic narrative in which a global viral pandemic has destroyed most of the world's population, and people are living a kind of pre-industrial life. They go around, on carts drawn by horses. They don't have electricity and so on. But nonetheless, as you can see from some of the quotes I picked out, there was still such beauty. After everything that was lost in the collapse, almost everything, almost everyone, there is still such beauty. And it's really striking. This novel, published 2 years ago, is just suffused with this incredible incredible sense of the beauty of the natural landscape. And it really leads us to question, what is our role as humanity? As sort of, we're not really guardians or stewards of the landscape anymore, because there's an Arcadian revenge taking place and nature manages to take back control of the natural environment. But I would suggest there is still the utopian kind of impulse, the sense of utopian possibility, understood as reflecting on our own world and our late capitalist world, and how we might think about changing that, is very much alive and kicking in these texts, just perhaps in a slightly reformulated way from Thomas More's early Ideal Commonwealth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you've given us a whirlwind tour of utopian thinking, and a very eloquent whirlwind tour, not just in terms of the literary utopias that have been generated over the past 500 years, but also in terms of the political philosophy that has been pursued in the wake of Thomas More's book. Without any further ado, we're going to move to the next speaker, Akram Khan. And again, I'm going to do a very brief introduction. If you allow me, Professor Akram Khan is a professor of particle physics here at Brunel University. Over the years, he's worked at some of the world's leading laboratories, including CERN in Switzerland and SLAC. It sounds... Yes, SLAC at Stanford. Akram is currently involved in research addressing the fundamental question, and it is a fundamental question, trust me, about the difference between matter and antimatter. And he's also in the field of applied science, working on the development of a new novel particle cancer therapy machine, and on what is supposed to be the next generation of internet technologies. Akram?
Thank you very much. I was waiting for you to explain what I really did. Yeah.
Well, let's not go there just yet.
So thank you. I mean, I think that was an amazing, wonderful sort of summary to some extent, and all the basic principles of utopian thinking historically, as it's led to where we are now. And what I want to do is just, I mean, we didn't plan this, but it was wonderful a place to start, because what I want to do is to think about, what does utopian mean to us as individuals? I mean, is it something that still exists, that is a part of us, and that we all have utopian dreams of some sort, but maybe not as grand as people think that they are, but really I think they are grand. And I'll try and argue that I think utopian thinking is critical and at the heart of humanity and at the heart of civilization to some extent. We all need to develop, construct and dream and let our imaginations loose to see what potentialities. There's a wonderful phrase right at the end you used. I mean, there are many, many potentialities of us and our worlds, because we are our worlds to some extent. And so we have to try and launch ourselves and swim within that sea of imagination. And whatever we get tangled into, so what? I mean, let's see what the entanglement is. I mean, there's this wonderful concept in quantum mechanics called quantum entanglements, where we're all related, all interconnected with each other somehow. But what emerges is what's very beautiful about living. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of it all? That was on the side. So I was going to go. So on my way here, I was thinking, well, actually, there are a few, few sentences. You can read the books, you can do all, but there are a few sentences which capture what, for me, utopianism means. And I'm going to try, being a scientist, I think we can create a schematic model of what utopian thinking is, because I think to have a method, which people have argued, I think is a wonderful thing. And it embeds within our sense of what it is, what it is, but what it could be as well. And there were these two wonderful quotes that I want to just share with you. And I think it captures, to some extent, everything or things that we have come across with Danny and Caroline just now. The first thing is by a wonderful classical scholar, Finlay. And what he said was, all utopian thinking has an element of fantasy, of dreaming, and at least yearning, a sort of a desire for something else, for a better world than we are at the present moment in. And all persons, I think, and I think it's absolutely, all persons dream in this way about themselves, in particular about the I, and about their families. But I think that's not only it. There are some that dream about, or could dream about, the societies in general, or the world at large. So you go from the individual to the world itself. I mean, we have different levels of utopian thought and dreams. I think I'll stand up, actually. My neck is not, gone out the days when I could do that. And I think there's another wonderful quote which depicts what Oscar Wilde said. And I think that, again, is absolutely an amazing quote. It says, the map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth glancing at. What's the point of it? For it leaves out the one country in which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out. That is a beautiful thing. We always have these aspirations. And we see a better country somewhere else. So it's not the landing, it's the process, the mindset. And then we set sail again. And it's this progress, I think, that is the realization of utopia that he goes on. So I think these are absolutely beautiful quotes. And what's in yellow is what I've highlighted, not the actual authors themselves. But I think I'm going to try and pick out these basic words and then try and construct a schematic view. So being a scientist, I'm going to try and now sort of draw some pictures so we can appreciate. So I think, yeah, you can work that.
Don't be in the way.
So I'm going to draw some pictures and try to highlight what I thought on the bus here, or in the car actually on here, but I wasn't drawing it. So I think, my feeling, and this is we can discuss. So we have a current state we're in, the world where we're in at the present moment. So this is my state of existence. So that's my current state of the individual, because I worry at a particular moment about myself. What state am I in? Because I can only understand, and even understanding myself is a big issue. Do I understand who I am to some extent? But it's the best one can do. I can never understand what you feel. I think it's very, very difficult. There are lots of entanglements, environment, cultural background. There are many, many things. So I can do the best is understand myself. And what I want to do is, I have aspirations or progress, that I want to make. I want to go into a state that is favorable. A favorable state I want to transition to. And I think to some extent there is a process of a desire. So that we are desirous. This may fall over actually. It's rocking.
Should be fine. No.
Or hope. Yeah. So these two elements of desire and hope to achieve a better state. And the desire comes from an intuitive self. You don't say, this is what I'm going to do. It's intuitive. It just naturally is inside you that I want to achieve X or Y somewhere else. And I want to achieve this state. And there's always a tension between the two of what you are and what you want in life, like most things. So I think it does create a sense of tension between the two. And I think this is very, very good place to be, because I think this desire and hope leads one to these imaginations. What they do is they produce these different, you may not achieve the state that you want to become, but you are prompted into dreaming. So you do actually come up with these utopian dreams or utopian imaginations different states of existence that you can potentially achieve, and you've been prompted in to think, and you don't just get one. I mean, these are dreams and fantasies and imaginations that potentially could come into existence. So you've actually put into operation a certain state that you could become. Now, it may not be the state that you want, right, which is good. I don't really care whether I can achieve that or not. But the mere fact that I have a desire and a hope, and maybe different dreams depending upon how I see my state, how I see myself, which is always evolving, always changing. So maybe the next day I'll have some other dream that could fulfill my particular new state of being. And then you can go this way. I think that's one way people can do. But there's another way that you can do this as well, I think. And that is where you only have one dream. Right? So you only have a utopian dream. Right? So you know what you want to achieve and what you want in life, or how you think a perfect society is. And you know how to do it. And you will do it, full stop. And there may be collateral damage associated with exercising that dream. But so what? I mean, that's just collateral damage. You will achieve a perfect society. So to achieve a perfect society, things can go wrong in sort of, other places. But but that's a greater goal to some extent. And I think there is a dichotomy, actually, you said earlier on wonderfully. There is a difference here, where this, in my opinion, the potentialities, as I said earlier on, is utopian. I mean, these are utopian imaginations, I think, to some extent. And I think the world on this side, where we know how to create a perfect society, as was said earlier on, are dystopian existences, or dystopian states of being in. So I see this sort of a one that we have here, because this is what we want to achieve, a 1 to n mappings. And I think a 1 to n mappings is a wonderful place to be. I think all of us should be in that. Well, I say all of us. Most of us should be. Well, I don't know. Anyone. If you want, you can be a part of that game. Or you can be a part of here. You can have this. So again, it's a 1, but in this case, a 1 to 1 mappings. And there have been many cases, as was earlier stated, which can lead to very problematic societies as well. But there is that division that takes place between the two of us. And I think we have to be mindful of this. But then I thought, well, actually, this is an interesting schematic diagram for thinking about the methodology that one can apply to one's living, as we do now, for example. And in fact, we do a similar thing at CERN. Well, I'm not going to give a lecture on CERN, but I'm going to talk about the scientific enterprise in its generic form as it is now. And I think we have a similar picture. And the question is, where do we fall in? Are we building a dystopian scientific enterprise? Or is it a utopian vision that we have? A much more nobler thing. I think we should all think utopian imaginations are noble. And so I'm going to do, not as an individual now, I'm going to do this as CERN, as a big scientific international laboratory, which has a certain goal. So we put CERN in here. So I'll do it right down here. So this is my CERN as opposed to me, the individual. And the question is, we have a current state of our theory. So we have our current state. Current state of the universe. So we have some mathematical theories which describe how the universe works, right? So that's my current state. But we're not contented with that. We want to describe everything in the whole universe. We want a theory that describes everything. And they call that the theory of everything too. So it's going to be a theory of everything. Now, whether we can achieve this is a separate thing. But we do, and there is a tension. So there is a desire. We have the same thing as desire and hope. And we have mathematical constructs for achieving that. And what we tend to do is to develop models to achieve that, right? So there is a tension, again, between this. But what we do is we develop lots of models to be able to achieve this. Now, we know, I think a lot of us do feel that maybe there isn't a theory of everything in the universe. But so what? I mean, that's that's something that I would aim for. But there's lots of dreams and imaginations as to how one could achieve that, and maybe even critique the fact that we cannot achieve a theory of everything. So I would argue that this, as opposed to understanding the self, which was the individual, I think this is understanding the theory, more mathematical, and my utopian dreams, many of them would be the different models that one achieves. And so in a way, I think that our enterprise, the scientific fundamental enterprise, is a utopian pathway, a utopian dream.
Sure.
Okay, so I think it is well, I can't finish now. So I think we are on a utopian mission. It's not a dystopian place to be, which is wonderful. I think I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We're now going to move to Peter Weigold's clip about, I'm not going to call it a utopian experiment, but it probably wasn't.
Well, it was a utopian.
All right.
Come to that.
All right.
Yeah. We had a nice day.
Well, you can describe it as a utopian experiment. I don't really know anything about it, so that's why I was reluctant to call it that. Peter Weigold is a professor of music here at Brunel University London, as I said in my introduction. We thought it would be interesting also to stimulate the questions coming from the audience, to show you a little clip from, there you go, an experiment that you conducted earlier. And you can tell us all about it, Peter. All right? Is it ready, Graham?
Okay. Yeah,
Peter.
Thank you. So I was talking to Jeff Rogers, head of research for the university, and we were talking about how we communicate. We can communicate within science or within arts, but how do we, what kind of dialogues go on that sort of run round every aspect of the university? And he said, see if you can do a project on it. And working closely with Akram and Claire Williams, Dean of Research for the university, we came up with the idea of going away with 16 academics for a day and discussing the sublime. What is the sublime in neural pathways? What is the sublime in astrophysics? What is the sublime more conventionally in 19th century literature or something? So we invited 16 people to talk for 5 minutes, and we went away to a lodge in Great Windsor Park, and they spoke for 5 minutes, and then we had various kinds of feedback. A musician fed back to a scientist fed back to a health person, and so on. And through the day, I had a wonderful day accumulating actually a lot of knowledge about what one another are doing, but also many insights into doing well, shall we call it, into the doing of things well. So if we show you the film, and then it might feed in to the utopian discussion.
I had hoped when I got to work this morning this was called Sublime Calculus. Actually, unfortunately, the author called it Calculus Gems. We was about 20 or 18 looking at and being shown this formula, e to the I pi equals -1, and being sort of awestruck by it. And it combines, there are 5 fundamental numbers. One,
that there is this sense of the beauty of what we normally categorize as certain phenomena or objects being beautiful. And in particular, the forms of the objects are bounded. So there's a boundary associated with those objects. The objects are benign, and then we think that there is purpose within the objects that one sees. And I think the sublime is a very rich category, but different and distinct from the beautiful. And I think it's where the objects are boundless. There is this notion of infinity, a notion of perversiveness, that there is huge potentiality that's associated with this, that is boundless. Also, there's a sense of the fear of the unknown, that the object itself can destroy the observer.
To think about how we actually research the senses and how we use then this research to design better cities.
The sublime power of endorphins. Everyone might already recognise that sometimes when you're engaged in sort of musical activity, performing with people, you can get an impression of the sublime.
Two ideas come to mind straight away, one of which, of course, is the connection of nature and the sublime. You think about Burke's definitions of it, that kind of extreme emotion in sort of great scenery, which we've seen with mountains. And I immediately thought that's very typical of the 18th and 19th century. What follows, of course, is the technological sublime in the kind of 20th century. And the idea of sort of machines, Akram's rather wonderful Hadron Collider.
So to me, the sublime is in here. The nature produces this lightning, and we learn from that lightning how to artificially create it in the laboratories, and as a result of that you can come up with a system which can actually work towards combating an abatement of these pollutions.
Explore the way in which music itself and musical works can themselves be sublime. Obviously one of the problems with Wordsworth is, or Milton or whoever it is that their work cannot in itself be sublime because it's constrained by language. Music doesn't have that constraint.
Who, whether it's your wife or somebody you know and see every day, think about this, that person you see every time you see, and I mean every in exact word, every time you see from a different perspective.
So I think what I'm going to do in the next few years is actually look at coffee, because it's become ubiquitous in our culture. It's often seen as incredibly mundane and not sublime at all. There are now companies selling us mini-me's and pixies and Y1s.
I had to think what sublimity means to me as an engineer and how it fits in the work I do as a media analyst. To me, sublimity relates to the eye.
If you go to the textbooks, you will find it says that DNA, the code for everything, changes by mistakes in its copy. And we were doing these big evolution experiments, and we found some rather remarkable things. One, even in independent experiments, the same changes were happening far too often for it to happen by chance. And when you see that, then you can understand how life can be so successful. How all the parts can adapt in real time to fit with each other. How different species can make that beautiful world.
William James was leading American psychologist of the early 20th century. He says, religiosity consists of the belief that there is an unseen order, and our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto.
And as a teenager, I spent weeks on end at the beach, always fascinated by the end of the beach and the start of the bay. The sand below kind of dropping away. And at this point, the dry land was suddenly absurd. And the whole world was then waves, blurry blackness. But in pursuit of understanding the unfathomable, I've rationally observed the natural world of water, I guess, in my profession, to understand objective quantifiable facts in the form of truths. But actually wanting to preserve the natural wonder, the sublime, that's always been there.
I want to stay with the natural, with strings, with acoustic properties, and interestingly, I'm also kind of wishing to find the darkness or the depth or the strangeness. I'm altering things. And I'm going beyond the order given to us by the Newtonian well-tempered keyboard. Interestingly, roughly, the proportions work out the same.
She is a visual artist whose particular interest is in breath. The background of this is my breath across a black piece of anodized aluminium, which is sitting on solid carbon dioxide being cooled down to minus 84 degrees centigrade. There's a well-known technique to people in optics called Schlieren, which allows you to visualize very small changes in refractive index. It's typically used in aerodynamics. There's one of us saying the word I, and that's the breath passing through the slurring field.
It's always an interest in boundaries, and to an extent I think I find the sublime in the boundaries, in the cracks in between.
Thank you very much. Right. Do you want to add something to
one word?
Sure.
3 words. Three thoughts. It's wonderful to hear Akram's distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, which we could dwell on a little more in the utopian perspective. And to hear, it's just, Sue Jobling's talks about unfathomable depths as interested in water. She lived as a child for water, for going out beyond, and then much later becomes a world expert in water purity. And I think that's a very beautiful wholeness about why she is and does what she does. I suppose there's three observations, obviously, or thoughts, questions. One is, what is the sublime? How do we live that? It's a little link to what Akram was saying. The second thought is very interesting to have a conversation across university disciplines. And it seems to me that there's so much interest in multidisciplinarity now that we kind of have an expertise within disciplines, and we need to develop a new kind of expertise, which is to do with talking across disciplines. And we enjoyed that much that day. And a lot of people say, well, this is why I came to university. So it also this is what I hoped university would be like that day. So it also sort of asks, what is university? I suppose, don't know, Caroline, if it's somewhere in history, there might have been an idea of the university as utopia at some time.
Bacon's New Atlantis imagines the ideal scientific college.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we live with all the things we have to deal with the university, but somehow also we still seek that deep conversation between us in the university.
Thank you very much. We have a good half hour to talk, to discuss, to debate. And I'll try and start us off. Maybe I should start with this whole idea of the sublime. I mean, you said it's very difficult to define what the sublime is, let alone where it sits and how it can be experienced. But I think most people would probably agree that the sublime is associated with, what should I call it? A state of elevated, unassailable perfection or beauty that can sit in a very broad range of human experiences. Yeah. So it's rarely associated with something that is dark and dangerous and threatening. It's generally associated with elevated beauty. And I think that's probably why it was decided, because I didn't know this was going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. That's probably why it was decided to actually include it in this panel in the first place. Now, if we take that concept of the sublime, then I think it's... You have to accept that Thomas More's Utopia is everything but sublime. I'm not talking about the book here, I'm not talking about the text, I'm talking about the world that is painted by, and dare I say, defended by Raphael Hirland. I mean, there's good reasons to say that the land of utopia, as it is presented by Hirland, both in the dialogue and in the discourse, because the book comes in 2 parts, is in some ways dystopic rather than utopic, dystopian rather than utopian. For one, well, people in utopia are not allowed to travel without permission, right? For 2, there are severe punishments for cheating on your wife or your husband. So marriage is considered to be sacrosanct, and everyone is expected to toe the line. Music in Thomas More's Utopia, as Hirland describes it, is only ever instrumental. You see, so the creativity of the utopians has to stand in the service of advancing the utopian ideals. Now, just some examples. And I think it shows how Thomas More, the writer, the politician, the humanist, was himself rather conflicted. Not just about the possibility of utopia, but about the whole idea of this being something that is possible and desirable. Now, I'd like to take that as a starting point to raise a question, a comment, I'm going to say a criticism, but you know, something for both of you that we can then use into the broader debate. I mean, listening to you, Akram, I'd say that there's a very strong humanistic current running through your model. Not the humanism of Thomas More, which was playful and which I think was not nearly as optimistic about human potentialities, but the humanism of the 20th century, the humanism that was recuperated by existentialist philosophers as a view of mankind that would see the human condition, well, you know, at the risk of putting words in your mouth, as intrinsically good, as being endowed with the possibility not only of articulating their fantasies, but also of realizing them in favor of creating something better. And I have serious reservations about that concept of humanity. I mean, you very carefully, and you didn't mention John Gray either, but you, I mean, you know as well as I do that and I'm not going to talk for John Gray, but you know that there are arguments to be formulated in favor of this view being overly optimistic about what human beings intrinsically want. And I think this humanistic current deserves to be put in a certain perspective, and maybe it's precisely because it's not there and will never be there that all the social experiments in favor of the creation of utopia have actually failed. So that would be my comment with regard to your talk. Now, and I would like to
I'm going to forget it, what you said.
Oh, you're going to forget? Okay, well, you
address it first.
Okay, you can address it first.
I mean, you've made huge comments.
Yeah.
I mean, and lots of things you said already. But I just want to focus on two things. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Utopian experiments are experiments that are directed. You know, they are done in fixed parameters or fixed frameworks to some extent. And I would argue that they would, by definition, it would be a very bad place to be. I would never like to live in one of those environments or one of the social places. Going back to your notion of John Gray, I'm not going to talk much about him, but I will say a few things, and that is, I mean, I think there is progress in humanity. You know, we do progress, and I know progress in civilization goes in cycles because, you know, we do progress and then there are bad things happen, as we see in the 20th century, and then good things happen. So I see it as an oscillation about a mean point. So if I thought about that, so I would argue progress would look something like this. You know, we would have progress on this axis and we would have time on this axis, right? And the question is, do we get progress? And this is a major point as I try to mention, so I have to draw a graph. And I think, and say this is the mean point. And I think you're right if you look at it like this. This is progress historically. You know, you get good points, bad moments in life, and overall is zero progress. And Gray would argue more or less along those lines. But what I would say is actually, it's more complicated than that, because there is scientific progress. There are progresses that one gets from generation to generation. You know, we know more about the world today than we did 100 years ago, than 100 years ago. So knowledge is increasing. And what I would draw, if I would take the red pen, because I'll mark you down, is the line of progress is like this, right? And this is time and progress. And what we see is exactly the same oscillation, because history is history. I mean, people do bad things and then they learn from bad things. And what you get is this. So I agree that if I looked at it from that direction, everything is zero overall because it's the same as this, but I think tilted up. But we do get progress over time because from generation to generation, things, we do pass on knowledge, we do store knowledge, which is the scientific enterprise to some extent. So I would say that, progress is at the heart of utopian thinking, and we need it to better oneself. And I would argue that, and I would say one more thing, just because there's so many things, so many interesting things you've raised. The sublime. I mean, it's not beautiful. The sublime is dark. It is frightening. It is the unknown. I mean, if I switched off the light here, for example, I mean, all sorts of potential can come out of there.
No, I would actually
and
agree
it's a
with
frightening
that.
environment.
Oh,
and I think it's the frightening nature which sparks a creativity within us, because then we can all go back into our instinctive, intuitive selves. And from that, anything beautiful. It may not be beautiful, it may be ugly. I think sublimity of the ugly. I mean, ugly is beautiful as well. And things like those are far more richer than seeing a Da Vinci, in my opinion, which is beautiful. And just lastly, right, because I think there's another interesting thing. I think innately, human nature is lonely. I mean, it's a wonderful, we had a discussion a few months ago, I think, about this. I mean, I think that innately we're all alone. And we hide ourselves from seeing those dark places. And there are all sorts of mechanisms of how we distract ourselves, because it is painful to look within. And celebrity culture, we switch on the TV, we go do other things in life to distract ourselves. But we are intrinsically alone. And I think we have to go back and we have to understand our core being of what it means to be alone. And that requires solitude. We need to sit and be with ourselves. Solitude, and then intuitively you have to get back in through your intuition and experiences and face your core being. And I think to some extent that is the pathway that one follows. I mean, this is the pathway. You have your instinctive desire, and then you have to search the self. You have to search your inner self. What is it that it needs? And not what society tells you, not what the media tells you, is what you feel. And your dreams and your utopian imaginations then come to the percolate up and get a wonderful coffee.
I mean, I would agree with you as far as the last 2 points are concerned. And when I gave my off-the-cuff definition of the sublime, I wasn't particularly speaking for myself. I was speaking for common knowledge without therefore underestimating your intellect, let alone that of the speakers here on stage. But I totally agree with you that the concept of the sublime is much more ambiguous than it's simply representing a state of elevated, unassailable beauty. I mean, you haven't persuaded me about progress, but I don't want to...
Let me try.
You can.
I've got 3 points in response to a very broad range of things that have been said that I think it's necessary to reflect on. I think the first of which, I'm a big fan of Akram's diagrams. It's the subject of an enormous amount of political philosophy and critical theory to disaggregate that sense of progress from actually time, from historical time. So there's a quotation about, yes, we do have technology, we do have, the atom bomb, and we do have particle physics and all of these things, but actually, does that necessarily guarantee or deliver social progress? And so I think it's really important as students of history and students of literature and culture that we disaggregate those two things. And so I like your more kind of fluid understanding. And certainly much of the utopian discourse of the 20th century, whether it's in social sciences, sociology, or whether it's actually literature, novelists and filmmakers and so on, very much these people are concerned with questioning this sense of progress. So if you go back to somebody like H.G. Wells, at the turn of the century, in the late 19th, early 20th century, in texts like The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, he's showing us that human progress doesn't guarantee or deliver a better future. And that's a lesson not just for the liberals to think about, it's a lesson for the socialists and the communists to think about, of course, because to imagine that you're just going to teleologically meet that better society because you're on the right side of history. History is with us, therefore we will just arrive at a better future, is an incredibly dangerous thing to think. That's my first point. The second point...
I'm still not convinced.
I haven't finished my argument yet. I'm just getting to the good bit about liberal anti-utopianism. So my second point actually is that I really enjoyed these diagrams, partly because this idea of utopian dreams as potentiality and possibility, it allows us to think about process. It allows us to think about a more flexible reading of utopia. My rejoinder to you is, Danny, that the idea that utopia is just a sort of monolithic better state and therefore it's quite authoritarian, it's one person's vision of utopia and it inevitably leads to a dystopian situation. That actually is quite a static misreading, and you're absolutely right to go back to Thomas More's Utopia, because we have slaves in Utopia. The utopian community can exist in this beautiful, peaceable society because slaves do the dirty work, because they won't butcher animals because it might offend their finer feelings. Mm-hmm. So they have to employ butchers from outside because there's that sense in which the boundedness of the utopian community can only work if it relies on labour from elsewhere. And so even when we go back to the literary utopia, which is a very different thing from utopianism as a set of practices for thinking across the sciences, the social sciences and the humanities, actually More's Utopia is much more layered and complicated than that. Mm-hmm. So I would suggest that the attitude that utopias inevitably lead us into a dystopian future city where we're all in Huxley's Brave New World is quite a misreading. It's a conflation of texts that really are much richer than that and deserve kind of our closer attention. Added to that is an interesting point about some of the most pronounced critics of utopianism in the mid-20th century from the liberal perspective, people like Isaiah Berlin, people like Hannah Arendt and so on. These were people who were fleeing fascism, fleeing the Nazi state in Germany. Many of them went over to America. Many of them, interestingly, were also of Jewish background. And so it's no surprise that you get a kind of liberal consensus in the mid-20th century whereby people say, if that's what ideas about building, engineering a better future lead to, we don't want to have anything to do with that. So I think there are good reasons to historicise that perspective, and I think it's a bit simple to say that we still may have that perspective today. And the third point, I just wanted to come back to this idea about the sublime, because that really interested me, actually. Ernst Bloch is one of the best-known utopian philosophers, a German philosopher who wrote an enormous oeuvre of stuff about utopianism. It's very difficult to read across all of his texts. And he argued that utopia is inescapable from death, which is such a strange, perverse thing to say. And he suggested that without death, we don't have the good society. We not only don't have an understanding of that slightly carpe diem, you have to live in the moment because one day we're all going to die, but also that death reminds us that this idea that we're all alone and we're all lonely individuals, actually that death only ends one individual life. It doesn't end the collective life and it doesn't end society. And so it forces us to reflect on more political relationships. How do we work towards an intersubjective or collective future that moves beyond a really avaricious kind of greed? What can I get in this celebrity-driven society? You know, what's in it for me? So I would suggest a return to Ernst Bloch as an interesting figure, which might reflect a little bit on the otherness of the sublime. The sublime is threatening. It threatens us. It threatens to destroy us, as does the apocalypse. And the apocalypse is also very utopian. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of rich, fertile territory for a kind of finessing, or what's the word, where you kind of a striation of how we might read these big concepts to lump together. Yeah.
Can I quickly come in on that? There's, the sublime moments in Spanish flamenco are known as duende, which means death. So you die in the sublime moment, or the performer dies, or we die.
But I mean, I agree totally with you. Obviously, I do. but I think also death. I mean, it isn't pessimistic. I think it's a rich and life-affirming place to be, because the appreciation that you know you're going to die. I mean, it puts one in a state of being, in a state of mind to say, well, actually, I will learn to appreciate, or I will value relationships, or I'll value people that are, special to me, as opposed to me having these external future felicities which may never be realized. And so in a way, the realization of an end, of the finale, of one's own breathing, is actually a richer thing. I begin to appreciate, I begin to value conversations, I begin to treasure moments, as opposed to living in a moment that may never come into being. And I think that is another wonderful, sort of, you can think of it very, dark and everything, but I think it has a wonderful gloss to it as well. The appreciation.
We're going to carry on disagreeing here. I'm going to draw the session to a close. I'd first of all like to thank the three speakers, performers, contributors to what I do think has been a lively and interesting and creative critical discussion. So thank you for participating, for coming along, and for sharing your views with us. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and I hope that you will take something away from our discussions.